So in our next round of lectures on agency, we're in our second area now on the slides. We have agency liability and termination. So here we have our same scenario. We have the principal, agent, third party, and we're going to talk about what kind of authority is given in that situation. So our authority here, we can have express or implied as actual authority. And then we could also see a term called apparent authority. We'll go into these here in a little more detail. So one question comes up is if something happens where a third party is harmed through a tort action, so either physically harmed or suffers financial damages or losses, can our third party sue? So there's something called vicarious liability, the idea that if the agent's acting in the scope of employment, then the principal may have liability here because either the principal authorized the agent to act or the principal was negligent in supervision of that agent. So the principal, kind of keyword terms we need here, principal is going to be liable if we have actual or apparent authority to enter into the contract with a third party. So actual authority we see could be the express, I grant you authority, implied based on the title of the individual, apparent authority based on what the principal's done to make the third party believe that that agent has the authority to act. Express authority, so this is direct, clear, definite terms. It's usually in writing, or it can also be an orally granted authority. The rule of agency law follows contract law that says if the underlying nature of the relationship would require a writing under contract law, then agency law would also support that conclusion that we'd need a writing if it's required under the rules of contract law. Failure to comply, so failure to recognize this, basically makes the contract optional. So it doesn't keep, the principal then has the ability to void that contract if it's not fulfilled in the required terms under contract law to have a writing. Express authority can have exceptions. So if we have an officer of a company acting for the corporation and doesn't have official written authority, we can assume that that executive officer is acting as an agent. If the principal is in the presence of, or the agent is in the presence of the principal, is probably a better way to say it. But if basically the principal is on hand supervising, then that can grant express authority even if there is not a contract signed. Or the final area, which is kind of a hard area to prove out in the law, would be when the agent's act of signing the contract would just be a mere formality. So the actions have already taken place, the principal's ratified the actions and then says, oh, we never did sign a contract, we should probably put that in writing. The idea that this is sort of happening after the fact of the contract. A power of attorney is one of those documents that I showed you in the very beginning of the lecture materials. So that can give express authority. So that's a document, oftentimes it's notarized to make it official. It can be a special authority, so it's for a specific task, or it can be general, that we give this agent authority to enter in all transactions on the principal's behalf. Typically, if it's not stated, then the document, a power of attorney document, would just end and terminate at the time that our principal dies or is incapacitated. Implied authority is different than the express side. Implied authority would be the agents acting with sort of vague or unclear directions from the principal, but the agent's acting within the scope of reasonable necessity. So I'm doing what needs to be done to fulfill my objectives I've been assigned to in this relationship with the principal. So implied authority may be the principal didn't say exactly how to structure a sale transaction, but the agent is given implied authority to figure out the best way to do so. Sometimes it's just based on the norm of custom in that business line. So is it customary for a sales manager to accept receipt of shipments of goods and inspect and accept those shipments? So if that's customary, then that can be implied authority, even though maybe nowhere in that manager's job description, does it say that he or she has the ability to accept and inspect goods. The implied authority that's granted to our agent, it can't override or run contrary to what we see as already in expressed authority by the principal. So the principal says you must do it a certain way, then the agent can't try to claim it was an implied authority to try a different approach. Apparent authority. So sort of how does this third party interact with an agent in this situation? So the agent, the agency test here would be, did that third party interacting with our agent reasonably believe that the agent could enter into the contract? So we want to make sure, another way of saying it is, we want to make sure we protect the third parties, those that are trying to engage in business transactions and not know whether or not this agent may or may not have authority to interact. So it really becomes a reasonable belief standard of that third party. Did you think that this agent had the authority to do what he or she was doing? A lot of times this is established not in this isolated interaction with the principal and agent, but through a pattern of relationships, either with this particular agent or with other agents in the same industry for this principal or service line for this principal. So we can see this evidence of reasonableness can often be brought in through other interactions and dealings with our principal. So our agent's authority, we have our apparent authority, and estoppel is kind of the other key term we're thinking about here. So an agency by estoppel is that idea of reasonable belief, that the third party acted because he or she reasonably believed that agent was allowed and required had the authority by the principal to act. When we say estoppel is a legal term for preventing someone from doing something. So you're stopped from denying the agent's authority for the principal. So we have an agency by estoppel. What that means is that the principal is prevented from saying, no, the agent wasn't acting on my behalf. And so that test comes down to what the third party that was contracting with the agent, what he or she reasonably believed. Some other terms that come up in agency in this area of liabilities, the emergency powers doctrine that came up before in the other lecture. Maybe the agent can't get a hold of the principal, and a decision has to be made very quickly. There is a provision to say in emergencies, sometimes that agent has authority based on the fact that some action had to be taken immediately. Ratification is when we have an agent sort of acting outside of what we've asked him or her to do as a principal, but we've accepted what that agent has done. So at that point, if we ratify, if we've given that indication to the third party, then that principal is now bound and must accept the actions of the agent as his or her own. So to ratify, we have to see that the agent was acting or purporting to act on behalf of the principal. The principal has to have knowledge of the material elements of the transaction, and the principal is going to have to affirm the agent's acts. So it can be a simple conversation with the third party. It can be a conversation with the agent from the principal, either way from the principal, but acknowledging that as a principal, we accept what the agent has done. Our principal and third party have to have legal capacity. So when the agent's striking the deal, was it in permitted under the law. And then our principal is going to affirm, which is another word for ratifying. It has to, this ratification to accept this transaction when it's outside the scope, it has to occur before a third party withdraws. So before the third party says, no, I no longer want to be in this transaction. The third party does have a right to pull back if our agent's acting outside the scope of authority. So if we do want to ratify as a principal, we need to ratify quickly, because until ratification happens, our third party can still void the exchange. And the principal here would have to follow the same formalities, whatever was required, would have been required under the law, or it's still required even though this is happening as a ratification as opposed to an express actual agency contract. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll talk about some liability for contracts next in a second part of this lecture.